Well, thanks for having us, and thanks for doing this.
Yeah.
It's going to be exciting to bring the story of Turn A Gundam to all the American fans, who, a lot of whom probably don't know a lot of the details we'll get
I don't
into.
think so.
Yeah.
No.
But I'd like to, before we go there, just kind of get into your background and how, obviously your first love is automobiles and cars. You went to art center and you worked for Ford. That was one of your big first things. And I'm
Not
curious.
that big, but okay.
It was a big name, at least.
Yeah.
So when did your fascination with car, was that something from childhood? Like, were you always drawn to?
Well, I'm now working on my autobiography. I figured I better do that so I can still remember all this stuff.
Right.
And so I started drawing when I was 2.5. I have a drawing. It'll be in the book. My parents saved everything, fortunately.
Oh, amazing.
And my first car drawing that I have, I did when I was 3 years old. When you're a child, you're looking up at everything. So the car has a lot of body and very small windows, sort of like now. So I was 70 some years ahead of the market, and there's people waving out the window of the car. So it was a scenario thing from the start. So the car fascination took over rocket ships. My father was a Baptist minister, and for some unknown reason, he read Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers to me before I learned to read. I have no idea why, still don't. So by the time I was 6, 7, 10 years old, that age group, starting grade school, I could draw really quite well. And by the time I was in high school, I could draw the human figure, could draw animals. I had sort of a sense of shading to show shape. And so I was really quite accomplished at that point with brush technique and so forth, doing cartoons. Went in the Army for 3 years. During the Korean War, I was in Okinawa. And then had a lot of fun in Okinawa. We were in Sukaran. We'd go down to Naha and get absolutely smashed on Kirin beer, and then find our way back to the barracks. And then I went to Art Center after that. So the 50s were Army, Art Center, and starting at Ford. I graduated from Art Center in 1959. And Ford hired me. I went into their advanced design studio, and that lasted 26 months. Then I got the connection to the company in Chicago that published the steel books. And so I quit Ford. My salary increased 5 times. And in 1961, that was a good thing. I was still young. And so I worked for the Hanson Company in Chicago about the next 9 years, let's say. And then started my own company in 1970 in Detroit. And my first client was international giant corporation Philips NV in Holland, in Eindhoven. That account lasted 12 years, and that funded the start of the company. And then I went into architectural rendering. The thing I'm very fortunate and very lucky, but I could illustrate very, very well, and I had a design training. So I could illustrate my own ideas, which is a great step up. Now with computer imaging and so forth, you can do rotational models of your design. But back then you had to make a drawing or a sketch. And then it went to prototype into a 3-dimensional format.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, just to take it back for 1 second to how you were so adept at such a young age, I find really interesting. I mean, it seems like you always knew, or you always had a proclivity to illustrate.
Well, I was sort of an insular child. I didn't associate very much with people my own age until college. They're having a 60th anniversary of my graduation class for high school. I don't remember anybody in the class. Now I did the posters for the athletic events. I was active in thespian and theatrics and all that, but I don't remember any of my classmates.
Did you mentioned your father introducing you to Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers? Did the notion of futuristic ideas and science fiction kind of have the same impact at a young age as drawing did, or was that something you were naturally drawn to, or did that kind of come?
Well, I learned to draw And I learned to draw better and better and better because if you're visualizing your ideas, and I had a propensity for fantasy, then the better you can render your idea, the more real it becomes as a fantasy extension of your imagination. And I think that's what drove me to keep trying and refining technique. And I had a lot of time. And nowadays, kids, you have dance class, the kids go to writing class, they want them to be a lawyer, doctor, whatever, politician, and they're pummeled into this constant 24-hour push to be something. And they end up, 35 and married, and they still don't know who they are. I knew who I was very early on, and drawing was part of it, and I spent hours and hours and hours drawing. So obviously, the more you do something, if you do it reasonably right, you get better at it.
How did your military experience kind of inform your artwork and your sense of, did that influence you at all as a design element?
The reason I joined the Army rather than being drafted is I wanted to control my life, timeline. It was as simple as that. And so I drew and painted myself through the Army, getting out of a lot of bad things because they found out I could draw. And I decorated the mess hall and the supply room and got along very, very well with the officers because I was helping their company look really nice. Once I was Okinawa, I became training sergeant for about 120 of the men in the company. The challenge of the Army was really to learn how to be social with a wide variety of people. And being in Okinawa for those 2.5 years was my first, my first introduction to Oriental and Asian graphics and the design mentality, and that was eye-opening. The whole history of Oriental/Asian art goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and the amazing thing. The Chinese practice of lacquer, and then you take an image of a chrysanthemum or some dragon or whatever, and you wrap it over the corner of a lacquered box. Well, that's mapping. That's what we do with computers now. That was thousands of years ago. They would do shoji screens or sliding screens in a ground floor space, but the tree line would be above the floor, so you'd be like you're above the tree line. It was an amazing exposure. Then I spent a month in Hong Kong at that time on vacation from the Army, and that was another sort of peek into a slightly different look at another subculture of mainline Chinese culture, and had dinner with the mayor, and I had a wonderful time there, and got drunk on very expensive wine. And then my next trip to Japan was in 1961. Between the time I quit Ford and went to work for the company in Chicago, I had contacts already in Japan. I had an art student that I'd met at Art Center. He was now in Nagoya. He was a ceramics artist. And another friend of mine, his brother was Time Life correspondent in Tokyo, so he knew all the spots. We had a wonderful time. The Tokyo Tower was new then. And then a friend of mine, Hans Bretzner, was from GM, General Motors. He had gone to Mitsubishi, and he helped them set up their auto design studio for production of automobiles. He had, at that time, this is 1961, there were only 5 Mercedes in Japan. The Palace had 2. There was one business executive, I think, that had buried his 2 Mercedes during the war, and Hans had the 5th one. So we go to Kyoto. He learned to speak perfect Japanese in 2 years because he'd already learned English from German. And he was like, some people are good at languages. And it took me, almost a year to learn how to say okonomiyaki, So we drive to Kyoto in his Mercedes, black Mercedes, with 2 geishas in full costume in the rear seat, wearing ties and jackets and shirts and trousers, and we were treated like royalty.
Wow.
We drove up in front of this hotel, and the baggage was disappeared into our room. It was fantastic.
So when you were in the military and you've got that exposure to the artwork, and is that your first impression of more the popular artwork, like the manga comics? Were there
No.
were those around? So this was more just the traditional
Traditional.
artwork.
Mm-hmm.
And what did you take away from that? I mean, how did that influence, do you think, or change your own work?
I think the influence was pattern, how you treat pattern as applied to objects. And then I went to Art Center. You learn why things are made a certain way. And I still like to apply pattern to primarily geometric solids. Organic shapes are nice because they duplicate sort of this natural feel. And I like that too. But I very much like geometric shapes. Then you slice them at an angle, which means you get an odd geometry. Or wrapping a pattern around, something like that. And the influence was in the modularity. My first trip to Japan in '61, as I mentioned, I stayed at the new Hotel New Japan in Akasaka, which is now gone. But I had an 8 or 9 tatami room, which was fairly large. And it just, the modularity, the carefulness of how things were arranged it impressed me a lot.
Did you, when you were first exposed to Japan and Hong Kong, were you affected by the urban design and the way the cities appeared versus American cities?
No. Tokyo is extremely visually confusing architecturally because it's a pre-medieval city. Now cars drive around, almost. The traffic jams are legendary, but there's no grid. So, because it's an old city, which just gradually had to pack stuff in where they can, and the buildings literally are shaped by the footprint of the land they can get a hold of.
Do you think it's there's a strange beauty in it though, even though it's sort of chaotic? Or I'm just curious what your takeaway is of the
aesthetic. Visual texture. All good directors of film like texture. When I first was introduced to Ridley and Michael Dealey at the first meeting for Blade Runner, the first thing Ridley told me was, he said, "This is not going to be Logan's Run," which was this blank sort of white, no texture. Sterile. And Ridley, of course, is a heavy texture guy, and the layering of the shot and all that. So in that way, the visual texture is fascinating from that standpoint. It's intense. It's very intense. Much more so than most American big cities, because our cities are newer. Boston, New York, they get sort of jumbled. Boston in particular, which is a street nightmare. New York does have a grid. Once they crossed Houston and came north, then it became a grid system, which is easy to find your way around in. In Japan, the house numbering is the oldest house has the highest number. Well, taxi drivers will have to ask local residents if they've never been there how to get to number 32 because they have no idea.
Right. Yeah, I've heard it said in Tokyo you don't really know things by street names. You know it by, it's next to the building that's blue and things like that.
Or it's 5 houses down from the police box,
right.
all over Tokyo.
Right. Well, going back to Art Center, when you went to Art Center is now quite famous, and you're one of the reasons probably it's famous now. What was it like in the 50s when you were there? Was it as prestigious then, or what was it, a different type of institution?
Well, it was on 3rd Street in Los Angeles between Macadam Place and Las Palmas. It's a very upscale neighborhood. Rossmore / Vine is to the east. There's a country club, a golf course nearby. It's a very elite residential neighborhood. The school was purchased by Tink Adams, and with the help of 2 older ladies, spinsters, the Franklin sisters, and so there it was. It was a girls' school prior to that. They moved to Pasadena, I think, about '72 to the new school up in Pasadena, and so there was no air conditioning. The air quality in Los Angeles at that time was so bad that the air would have this blue-tan color to it on some days, and you could taste it. The particulate, it was so thick.
Wow.
And yet you had to go to your miserable non-air-conditioned apartment and do precise artwork with paint or charcoal or whatever. And Art Center early on had made an alliance with the Japanese government. I don't know whether it was MITI or the whole formal export agency, but they started to bring Japanese young people over to Art Center, train them to go back to Japan, so they knew the American marketing, design preference mentality for export. That's where and that was a big, big cultural window for Art Center, and a great thing that Tink Adams thought up. Then they were going to open a branch, a postgraduate branch in Kyoto, and I went with them on that trip. A big presentation, the mayor of Kyoto and some of the political luminaries. That never happened. But I have a little story about Kyoto. We had just been watching there's a temple architecture garden kind of motif where they build these careful sand pyramids. They're perfect. So we just seen that walking along. It was in the fall, and probably next month, September, something like that. And I collect leaves from all over the world. I have leaves from Norway, from Germany, from Sweden, all. So I wanted to bring back a leaf from my trip to Kyoto, a Kyoto leaf. And it wasn't a ginkgo, it was some other, like a Japanese maple or something. So I just bent down to pick up this leaf, and I was looking at it, and I had just a little tiny tear on the tip, and I thought, well, you know, this old lady with one of these twig brooms was brushing the walkway. And she said, Joto, Joto, Joto. And she reached out, she found a better one. And she said, Dozo, Dozo. I thought that was so nice.
That's awesome. So you started your own company after Ford.
Yes.
And was the purpose of the company, automotive or just design? What was your anything and everything?
Well, between the Hansen company and my own company, that span of time, I worked for a corporate group in New York called Intergraph, and they did point of purchase collateral material, brochures, and so forth, which I'd been doing for the Hansen company. And that entity was sold to a larger group, and they eliminated our group that I was working for. So now I had no job. So I started my company with no clients. I turned down Chrysler. They wanted me to go to South America, to Sao Paulo, to be their idea sort of guy down there. And I said, well, I have a corporation now. Can I go as a consultant? And they said, no, you have to go on contract. For tax reasons, really, for them. Turned down, I did a couple jobs for General Motors, Styling Center. But essentially, I had no clients. And then Philips gets a new design director, Knut Iran, Norwegian, multi-millionaire. And he heard about me through Jerome Gould's office in New York, because Jerome Gould's office was designing packaging for Philips for the American market, North American market. And Knut was looking around for somebody to be more visionary than the European trained designers, who are more engineering adjustment trained at that time. So he comes to Detroit on his way to Tokyo to visit their satellite office in Tokyo. We go out to dinner, and so I had the account for the next 12 years. And that was a turning point in terms of going to Europe, having a more sophisticated environment to pick up cues from, so forth, and found out how embarrassed you are when you go to a cocktail party and everybody there is trilingual, okay? English, their native language, and maybe another one, French or German, and you walk up to a group and they all start speaking English and you don't understand anything they were saying before that. Then they make double entendre or triple entendre jokes, which depend on knowing 3 languages, because otherwise it's not funny. It was an amazing 12 years going over there back and forth, and we've been over there many times since as invited guests for film festivals and just travel.
Right. I'm just curious to ask you what you think of the state of, we're seeing a technological shift with cars in the last few years, because gas, as we record this, is like $4 a gallon. And so hybrids are starting to come about, and cars are starting to look a little bit more, they're looking different, I think.
Yes.
There's a design. And I'm just curious what you think about where it is now and where you're you see it going? Obviously, this gets into very complicated geopolitical situations,
yes,
but I'm not trying to go there, but just more as an aesthetic, you know.
There is no domestic-made automobile anymore.
Right.
First of all, the first big car I bought was a '61 Cadillac Coupe de Ville. Second one was a '63 Cadillac, '65 Cadillac, 1970 Imperial. These are all cars that are 2.5 tons and between 19 and 20 feet long. And the one out in my driveway now is a '72 Imperial, my collector car. Of course, when those cars were built, gasoline was 35 cents a gallon or less. And the big difference in